So Griffith from the Band of the Hawk materializes the function according to the narrative inside the D&D campaign, or however they want to evolve it, from the Bannerlord type series, which then manifests the function of each going through periods of the various time, in which case it materializes into the ancient, which is the reflection upon the future, projecting the material components, which then, on maturity, would materialize into the fashion of the function of magic, such as from D&D, which then, presumably, being a mixture of deep study upon the horoscopes and the stars and the readings and the translations and the viewing, facilitate the function of a religious psychedelic experience, such as magic mushrooms, and thus the action of consuming various advantages, such as reindeer pee, would then materialize the full function of the group consciousness, and upon a bit of luck, then it would share that consciousness, which then could be translated as the reciting of the things going on according to the ritual, would actively have the clerics decipher and write down the expressed experiences before, during, and after, which would then materialize the projection into the future upon how this would manifest itself into the realities, so that they, having a projection from this sacred meeting into how to set up future meetings, which then would allow them to construct their objectives in everything that they would want to prefer to do in order to successfully sell it to the next group, and so on and so forth, all of the way to the end, until you've manifest the goal at the end, at which point their projections, being fundamental, create the manifestation of the Legend of David Company, which is the original, before David was born, ideas of their projection of the horoscope of Fire Tiger and of Libra and all other facets that they would like to look into, in which case the function of their diverse horoscopes, which are first hyper-concentrated and then super divided out, including the function of the Roman horoscopes, which give specific credence to the specific days in question, which would make the day of birth important, which would be difficult for most of the people at that time, where it would not make sense. For the exact ability to pick the day would be inconsistent with their abilities to understand how to do all of this without proper women capable of delivering children. At which point, that evolution materializing to experiences beyond what would be publicly accessible would actively be designed in the entrancement and entanglements to confuse most people so that they could maintain the secrets while constructing the function of their religious practice and the continuation of its commerce. To this extent, the continuation of the Bannerlord type series materializes the function of their specific crafting of armor, according to the Druid religion, and thus the function of the embodiment of the hawk materializes the superiority upon speed and grace and scouting, etc., at which point the function of their superiority in battle asserted themselves as a superior force, at which point they could materialize their advancements if they could properly sell a hyper-refined ability. To this extent, the function of the pre-version materializes the Griffith character, as well as the function of the Don Senior character and the David character, etc., etc., etc. At which point the ancient times variant would then bring forth the ability for the hyper leadership from the Don Senior and Don Junior function, as well as the crafted superiorities of the gathered blacksmiths and so on of the David character, which then materializes the function of their progress and the development, as their objective is not to rule as kings, but to actively trade and include the function of the preservation of the entire grouping, materializing the function of not being interfered with the common progress. To this extent, the function would materialize in their progress, as the Griffith is the superior leader, specifically assigned as an insurance promotion or security over the David character, which then materializes the function of their engagement in battle and the focus on high AC tactics, at which point the active development materializes the high likelihood of the creation of legendary characters from David's blacksmithing, which then includes the function of the psychedelic experience, which then, in their studies, as the function of the Griffith character having traveled all across the world, had made a name for himself and asserted his superiority in training upon the Eastern tactics, such as close to Japan and China and the rest of them, at which point he is quite capable with these advantages, given his superiority in these functions, such as the function of the creation of his version of a samurai sword with Damascus steel, which then materializes the function of its periodic upgrades upon these superior advantages. At which point the function of the induction of the psychedelic world creates the secret hyper secrets of the arcane knowledge, at which point the pursuit of the various advantages, such as the secret schools and runes, etc., materializes the function of an unmovable rod, which is then crafted into a big freaking sword, which would commonly be understood as Sephiroth's sword from Final Fantasy VII. At which point the crafting of the two, of the ethereal and the material into one, from the legendary creation of the legendary sword, from the blacksmithing, which required the induction into the psychedelic or into the function of the sorcery, infuse the magic into the thing, at which point the function of the creation, the introductions of the progress would hyper-concentrate throughout time and then hyper-expand, and then hyper-concentrate and then hyper-expand, to which point you would actively induce the influx of the magics, which then creates the Berserker's God, which is based upon the function of the material evilness of the human race, which then engages in the function of the various needs and adventures and complications and difficulties, which then must be provided. At which point, with this new creation, the Griffith character would have gone off on his own, leaving it, having purchased for himself from resources that he would not have spent on other things, as he was not known to actively hyper invest into his own personal interests so much as the function of the use of it for practical purposes, as most things were not outrageously entertaining to him, as most of the entanglements in society systematically seemed distant. To this extent, his hypercreation allowed for these scrolls, at which point the random encounter at level 1 having transformed himself into an Aarakocra in the psychedelic experience, killed the invading creatures, at which point he came across a Tarask, at which point his ability to fly as the Griffith in question, as an Aarakocra, as his spirit animal, materialized his ability to push it and pin it into place as his sword stabbed into it, and it discovered that it was not able to move, at which point he was able to manufacture several enchantments and attacks, in which case he would have killed this mighty beast, allowing for the moving of the primary warband leaders into beginning to mine the creature. At which point, the ingestion of the dwarves facilitated the capacity of the infinite reproduction of their hyper-refined specialty in blacksmithing, turning the Tarask leather into shields, etc., as it is mined, which includes the function of the creation and collections of diamonds, at which point the function, having asserted itself into the superior context of investing into mining as a primary function, which then allows them the ability to engage in hypercastle, so super secrecy, which then materializes the function of their entire social dilemma. As the intoxications of great evil surrounds them and the lawlessness of them materializes the active threats, which as a system of rebellion is hyper accentuated by the dark druids or the undeath wizards, etc., etc. To this extent, the function of all of the evils crafting themselves materializes the function of perpetual threats, which then seek the full eradication of all forms of order, which, to that extent, creates the hyper reflection upon the future about the new dark wizards claiming to be wizards of light in the inversion, as the function of the undeath materializes the function of their companionship with Frazo Lul, who facilitates the capacity of the creation of illusion, which then materializes the active topsy-turvy exchanging functions, which allows for the spirit of reincarnation as a concept to have materialized upon the exchanges and materializations in the hyper-centralized function of the karmic rivers, which then facilitate the ability to have engaged in the KKK in the future, which upon its destruction would come back to life again, similar to, I believe it was the Spirit Naga, which then materializes the function of its perpetual undeath, their core ideal as ghouls and goblins and creepy things, and everything that those types of things would be into is the manifestation of what they like. That is what they are, it is the only thing they'll strive to become. At which point the function of those future manipulations would engage in the activity of the Wizards' Council control, which then engages the traumatization of the general public, systematically eradicating the function of humanity as it engages in communist revolutions and hyper-centralizes the concentrations of powers and weaknesses for the purges, not just of the counter-revolutionaries, but of the revolutionaries, as most of them would have been derived by children of the clan who were mixed bloods from slavery in the Confederacy, etc. To this extent, the hyper-decentralization of the function of companionship engages in the reconcentration by the purging or eradications and murders, which includes the revolutionaries engaging in extreme violence against each other, and predetermined, selective, planned weaknesses in each, as everyone who is not the right type of white is systematically eradicated by their own, their competitor, their opposites, themselves, as this is nothing more than glorified suicide. And the function of the glorified suicide hyper-centralizes the creation of higher-end undeads, which then are absorbed systematically in the rituals and deprived of all of their value, even the function of their negative energy, which, as necrotic value is concerned, is hyper-concentrated in the rituals for more powerful elites, such as your grand wizards and your cyclopses and your blah 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 blah, things that make them feel good from their fake education and their misdirection under the false assertion of any kind of intelligible gibberish. Derived to this extent, the function of the hyper de-escalated value hyper concentrates the taken value, as the function of the creation was stolen by the suction of life into death, to be held in the in-between of the undeath. So too their de-escalation in the consumption of undeath is absorbed into the hyperconcentration of the promotion of their leaders as they become the lower level, disposable trash of the white supremacists, at which point the white trash becomes hyperconcentrated upon its bondage and acceleration, creating the function of arbitrary enchantments, which then manifests the action of undead raids, which is otherwise referred to as a zombie bomb. This hyper-decentralization and reconcentration materializes the capacity of opposites and escalations and de-escalations and opposites and Hegelian manifestations, as well as communist satanic magic. And this materializes the function of the creation of seeking to become or manifest the existence of Vecna, which has protected the function of being able to reproduce his own kind, and thus the action of protecting from the ascension process by the God of Secrets materializes the activity of the failed versions creating Nothics, and thus their wish, which they cast upon the function, creates the capacity for them to recreate Vecna, which is granted, as there is no way of not doing it, and the gods must conform and the universe must manifest their Vecna. This then creates the hacking function of breaking the lock by sheer force and brutality, at which point the hypercreation of Vecna requires all of the wrong answers to be completely expunged until they eventually acquire it, at which point they must sacrifice the correct number for the creation of Vecna, which then creates a Nothic, and they have to go through all of the systems of possibilities, 1 to, let's call it 1,000,000,000, one creation of Vecna ritual 1,000,000,000 times until eventually they get the ritual just right, despise all of the secrets, at which point the function would eventually create over time from enough murders and ritual sacrifices, etc., would create their god and king, the only thing that they've ever hoped for, the eternal unfeeling, undeath of their own reflection. As they seek the function of undeath as ghouls, randomly engaging in the function of their random raids, in order to assert their core ideals as a silly little prank from their drinking club, which systematically seems nonsensical at first, and progressively accelerates itself as individual people are smart, and groups of people are stupid, and thus the function of the creation of the socialism allows for their collective intelligence to be completely dispersed and dispensed of into the lowest common denominator, while raging drunk. That being said, shenanigans ensue, and again and again and again, until their rituals manifest a relevant devil or demon, who will then materialize as the function of their progress for its own ends. And they serve it well, and it rules them. And the function of Razul, their one true loyalty, their god of deception, allows their undead stench to be tolerated amongst a human society which should have avoided them from the clear signs that should have been available before obstructed in secrecy, such as the function of censorship and other functions, at which point they'll have pretty words and elaborate speeches and distractions and improv classes in order to distract from the manifest realization of their crimes, at which point their progress seeks the function of reconquering the government as an espionage terrorist organization. In this extent materializes the progress towards their own ends at service to their God King. So that historic norms, which are not historic, nor norms, can be preserved in all relevance as the function of all of the traumas against society and terrors which society is condemned for is the function of those very things, in which case clever men have ingenious ways to engineer a word to mean its opposite, and thus there is no remedy to a Confederate spell. Or so they would help, or hope, or develop, or create mischiefs to make people believe until it's unchallenged, at which point the function of the Soviet Union's light blue helmets and their rape culture can be reconstructed as their relationship, creating and developing new allies, creates their context inside of the Soviet Union, which converts them into the satanic ritual magics, which then creates the function of the demoralization processes and advances their arcane knowledge of forbidden things. To this extent, the function of destroying the United States without firing a single shot was in the creation, conversion, and development of this clan and its capability to infiltrate the American and West's governments. Their creation of specialness and uniqueness in quality and superiority boasts the function of the past as it shocks awake out of the ritual stupor of the Griffith in question, reforming into human manifestations, having removed his claws and talons and feathers for human flesh and keen mental perception, materializes the function of this stupor, at which point the activities of their competitor druids actively fighting for religious controls materializes the function of these threats as they would seed in the past things to be discovered upon the arcane research and archaeologists, which would then materialize the function, similar to the rise of the undead with Bruce Campbell, which then materializes the function of their ability to recite ancient incantations, which then raise the undead horrors which have been buried deep inside the consciousness of the world's memory, at which points the runic developments which have been crafted around the world, having actively engaging in the hyper development and adjustments and cycles of that energy wave materializes the form of memory as a karmic river, which then materializes the activity of the fact that the future projects to the past, projects to the future, is the same in time and memorial as a single event, as though the existence of time itself is an extra delusion from an extra dimension, which can be bypassed with certain specific knowledge and ability, as it expresses itself in rhythm and engages in the function of telling the most mischievous tales, which can manifest themselves into the more dire expressions of exactly what Griffith was looking for. And thus he did not need the continuation of the ritual, as he has found it, the secret on how to develop the next series of material. The hawk is perceived to have left and created to himself his own reflections and entanglements upon the generation of the god hand, would then have evaporated from existence, according to the rest of the party, entranced in the same dream world of psychedelic imbuements. And there you are, separated from them all, having just witnessed all of this. The introduction of your party. You negotiate with the rest of them. Roll for initiative.